again. For my God, it's time for us to protect and defend.
Hello, I'm Father Michael Orsi. I'm your host on Action for Life. This is a different kind of a program. You hear a lot of bad news. This show is about good news, except today we're going to deal with a topic that is a difficult topic and certainly something that we need to bring some light into the darkness. We're going to talk today about suicide, and especially the growth in our country from state to state of physician-assisted suicide. I've asked a very wonderful priest friend of mine, Father Dennis Cooney, to be on this program with me. He's a pastor, very much involved with the pro-life movement. But as a pastor and as a former seminary rector, he's someone who's had to deal with these issues. So I want to look at what's going on in our country, how we can counsel people who are maybe depressed, maybe dying of an illness, or maybe just tired of life. And Father Cooney is here to enlighten us and to perhaps give you something that you could pass on to someone else who thinks that the world would be a better place without them. So, Father Cooney, welcome, welcome, dear friend.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Father, a number of years ago, I got to the cemetery before the hearse arrived, and I'm walking along the tombstones, and I'm looking at the tombstones, and there are people there who were born later than I, 1970, 1980, 1990, even 2000. And I'm saying, what happened here? So when the funeral director came, I said to him, there's a lot of young people here. What's going on? He said, well, Father, he said, it's automobile accidents. He says it's drugs and it is suicide. And I go, wow. Even, young people who are killing themselves. And this really is a very important pastoral issue that I'm sure you've probably dealt with in your ministry. What would you say to someone, a young person, and then even an older person, who says life isn't worth living?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Well, again, I think the most fundamental truth that we need to start with is that we are not our own creators, and so therefore our life is not our property. It ultimately is a gift from God, and I do mean we need to emphasize the fact that it's a gift. When you look out at the universe and you realize that everything there did not have to be there, that God did not need me, He did not need the universe, He did not need the human race, but it was a pure act of self-giving generosity, the gift of life. That's I think the heart of the matter, to understand that life is a gift. Someone said very nicely and very true, it's very true, that our lives are God's gift to us. What we do with those lives is our gift to God.
Now, how do you get this message out to young people who have been led to believe in their personal autonomy? I could do whatever I want.
Exactly.
And when I've had enough, I can simply end my life. Or as the young people say, I'm going to off myself.
Exactly. Well, it's a very old philosophy. It's called Stoicism, because the Stoics believe that. They believe that, you are the absolute captain of your own soul, and you lived as long as you chose to live, and as soon as you became tedious with life itself, you just offed yourself. In other words, this only becomes understandable if you exile God. And, in that wonderful encyclical that he wrote a number of years ago, The Gospel of Life.
Wasn't that a beautiful piece of work?
Oh, beautiful indeed.
This is John Paul II, folks, around 1995, correct?
Yes,
Yeah.
1995, The Gospel of Life by John Paul II. he pointed out two things that are at the heart of the whole culture of death. Whether or not we're talking about euthanasia, or talking about assisted suicide, or talking about abortion, or whatever the case may be, he said two things. First of all, a distorted understanding of freedom. That our freedom has been granted to us, given to us by God, so that we may freely respond to his goodness and his truth and his love, and also use that freedom to love each other on this earth. Again, the two great commandments: love God with your whole heart, mind, and soul, and your neighbor as yourself. And then the second thing he said is the eclipse of God. I love that expression, eclipse. Remember, when the sun is eclipsed, the sun doesn't go out. It's just that there's an obstacle in front of the sun that prevents us from sharing in its light. And so therefore it's the eclipse of God, and that's what's going on in our culture.
Okay, so this is, you're talking about a very secular society.
Very much so.
And how does this secular society convince people that they are disposable, that when life becomes inconvenient, they could end their life? And how does this get translated into the political arena?
Oh, well, very easily. First of all, let me just point out something about our culture. I think it was T.S. Eliot, the poet, who said that in our culture we're distracted from distractions by distractions. And that is so true. We look at how we're not capable of even spending some time by ourselves in silence. We have to fill that vacuum. We have to fill it with noise. And very frequently this is exactly what our culture does. It distracts us. And I remember, again, C.S. Lewis in his famous work, Screwtape Letters.
Oh, wonderful.
Wonderful book.
These are the senior devil and the junior devil talking to each other.
That's right.
Yeah.
And the senior devil, Screwtape, says, you know, these human beings think that we do our best work by putting things into their heads. Actually, we do our best work by keeping things out of their heads. So again, to appreciate, help young people, but old people as well, realize that every moment is a gift from God, and every gift also comes with a responsibility, an ability to respond.
Right.
I think this is the vision that we have to, as Christians, as Catholics, as believers in God,
Hey, we have the term.
we need to return.
We hear the term being used, pro-choice.
Oh, yes.
And usually we identify pro-choice with the beginning of life issues. But can you tell us about how it's expanded to end life issues?
Of course. Again, with this false notion of freedom, which is total autonomy, and the word autonomy means a law unto myself, we believe that I give myself meaning, and in a sense I do, in the sense that I accept the meaning that God has revealed to me, but they're saying that you create your own meaning. You're in a meaningless world, and therefore whatever meaning exists there, it's because you put it there. Well, that's false. That's false. And so therefore this is the thing that we have to correct, this autonomy, which means that I'm a law unto myself. There is no objective right or wrong, good or evil, and I can do whatever I want simply because I want to.
You know, I always think about the movie It's a Wonderful Life.
Yes.
And, you know, George wanted to end his life. He thought there was no meaning to it. And then an angel comes, Clarence.
Right, Clarence.
And he guides him through so many situations that he never imagined.
Exactly.
And then he said, wow, my life had meaning. My life is worth living. He went back and he looked at the past and he saw how he was instrumental in so many life-giving experiences for other people.
Absolutely.
And I think a lot of people forget that. They don't see how valuable they are as individuals, but how valuable they are to society.
Exactly, exactly. But again, I think you're touching on something right that's at the heart of the matter. People do not believe, a lot of people don't believe that they're loved.
Yeah.
And you know, there's a wonderful story about an archbishop. I remember him telling this story, that he was going to a church to confirm. And he got out of the car, and there was this woman who was walking down the street, and he just smiled and waved at her. Years later, he came back to the same parish, and that same woman came up to him, and she said to him, she says, you know something, Bishop, I was planning to kill myself. And in fact, when I saw you get out of the car, smile and wave at me, I realized that I was loved. And my life is worth something in God's eyes.
Wow.
So even those little gestures of kindness and respect affirms the goodness of life, which God, by the way, does.
And everybody can do that.
Yes, they
Everybody can do that. I remember a number of years ago, I was teaching at a law school, and I had a little tradition of going around to the students as they were studying, and they were terrified, and their brains were all scrambled. And
Yep.
I'd put my hand on their shoulder. How's it going? You'll be fine. Don't worry about it. And a number of years later, a young man came over to me. He was a practicing attorney. He said to me, "Father, you got me through law school."
Isn't that amazing?
And I said, "What do you mean?" Certainly not by what I taught. He said, "No. When I was doubting myself, when I was ready to quit," he said, "you put your hand on my shoulder and told me everything was going to be okay."
Exactly.
So it does make a difference. How we relate to each other and how we dignify each other by the smile, by the hand on the shoulder, and sometimes by witnessing to the gospel itself.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Affirming that your life is definitely worth living.
Right.
Definitely worth living.
Right.
Because God believes that it's worth living, and I believe it as well.
Right. You know, we were talking a few moments ago about the secularization of society. And I think Dostoevsky said, you know, with God, anything is permissible.
Without God,
anything is permissible.
Yeah.
And the more God gets removed from the public arena, everything is becoming permissible.
Exactly.
It's not just abortion. It's not just same-sex marriage. But it is the life issues, the end of life issues. And so, you know, we have a lot of people now saying, well, at the end of my life, you know, I want to not suffer. And I'm instructing my doctor, this is what I want and this is what I don't want. And what I want to talk to you about when we come back is I want to talk to you about active euthanasia and passive euthanasia, because in our own country right now, with Medicare, doctors are going to be encouraged to have these end-of-life discussions with their patients. And I think it's a lot of the time, it's the way a doctor presents these issues to somebody as to the decisions that they are going to make.
Exactly.
And then we're going to talk about the states where there is physician-assisted suicide. So when we come back, we're going to handle these very delicate, they are delicate issues. This is not just a matter of somebody saying, I'm going to take an overdose and kill myself, but this is actually where people are going to have people involved with medicine who are going to be able to help them be comfortable, help them to die with dignity and respect without actively killing, because a doctor is about life.
Absolutely.
And he is not about death.
Exactly.
So when we come back, we'll have Father Cooney talking to us about passive euthanasia, active euthanasia, and this terrible spread of physician-assisted suicide in our own country.
As I remember, now they're even missing from December. God's gone missing, Jesus too. Does that even bother you? God's gone missing, Jesus too. Looks like the minority rules, and the Christian world looks mighty weak. No fight at all, just turn the cheek. Time to stand and be much bolder. Time to move on, we're Christian soldiers. God's gone missing, Jesus too. What on earth are you going to do? Oh,
Now, what does that mean? We throw that word out a lot, sacred, sacred. What is sacred? Sacred is that which is consecrated to God and belongs to Him in a very special way. And that is true of every single human life. And as we're reminded in today's gospel, that is true of marriage as designed not by the Supreme Court, not by the state, not by the government, not by polls, but by God Himself.
That's another whole issue right there, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. We're back with Father Dennis Cooney. We've been talking about really end of life issues, and there are a couple of terms that I think our audience has to be familiar with before we go any further. Ordinary means of preserving life and extraordinary means of preserving life. Could you talk to us about that?
Absolutely. If you don't mind, Father, I'd like to read to you from the Catholic Catechism.
Yes.
And paragraph 2278. It says that discontinuing medical procedures that are burdensome, dangerous, extraordinary, or disproportionate to the expected outcome can be legitimate. So we don't have an obligation to use extraordinary means that are burdensome, difficult, whatever. And I often like to say to people, they're not obligatory, they're optional. If you wish,
give us an example. What would be?
Well, I mean, for example, let's say you're diagnosed as having a disease where if you were to move to another climate, okay, you could extend your life, okay? Well, that would be tremendously burdensome for your family and for your relationship with your life, with your friends.
Cost,
yeah. That all of those things. So therefore, you're not obligated you could, but you're not obligated to do that.
Okay.
Or the same thing with a special operation that offers a chance of prolonging your life, but it's not absolutely
right. So this is experimental.
Exactly.
Or, you got maybe you got a 10% chance.
Exactly.
You don't have to do that.
Precisely.
Okay.
Precisely. But and then he says here, one does not will to cause death. One's inability to impede it is merely accepted.
Mm-hmm.
The mortality rate, remember, remains at 100%.
Yeah. The will to cause death.
That's right.
What does that? That's key.
That's the essence of murder. Okay, when I deliberately, willfully, intentionally take the life of an innocent human being. The choice to do that is a homicidal or murderous intention.
So that's when God forbid, but it happens, a doctor or someone else says, I am going to deliberately cover your mouth and smother you to death.
That's active euthanasia. The other would be physician-assisted suicide, where I give you the means by which you take your own life, the medicine.
So I just leave something behind.
Right.
And say, when I leave, you can just take this pill.
It would be like leaving a loaded pistol on the bedside of someone who is talking about killing
you are
himself.
Then enabling. And of course, the person that does that is just as guilty as the person that is going to kill themselves.
Because you're willing it.
You're willing it.
You're willing the person's death.
Right.
If I may complete this paragraph, the decision should not be made by the patient if he is competent or able, or if not, by those legally entitled to act for the patient whose reasonable will and legitimate interests must always be respected. But even if death is thought imminent, the ordinary care owed to a sick person cannot be legitimately interrupted. What would be ordinary care? Food, nutrition, hydration, a warm environment, ordinary care. For example, if someone has a cold that can be treated with ordinary medicine, this is obligatory. It's not optional, it's obligatory.
Now, let me ask you this question.
Yes.
Suppose you have someone who is dying of a terminal disease,
right,
cancer, and they're at the end stage.
Right.
Would this person have to be hooked up to a feeding tube?
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. Although, again, if the person is in the last stages of dying and the body is not even able to absorb the hydration or the nutrition, But to deliberately, with like in the famous case or the infamous case that was
Terry Schiavo,
Terry
that
Schiavo,
was
10
actually
years,
trying to kill her.
That was actually trying to kill her. That is what we call passive euthanasia.
Right.
So if I deliberately withhold ordinary medicine or food, hydration from another person with the intention, of course, of killing them, that is what we call passive euthanasia, and it is murder.
Okay. What about in the case you'll have somebody who is on a respirator? Now, that's extraordinary.
It can be extraordinary. Again, depending upon the circumstances of the situation. If the respirator is to keep the person alive so that the treatment can eventually have beneficial results for the individual, then in that particular case, it may be obligatory, especially if it's a young person, a father or mother of young children, so on and so forth. On the other hand, if the person is, say, at the end of his life, he is terminal, he is dying, and he chooses not to use the respirator, that is definitely that is definitely extraordinary.
Right.
Again, extraordinary means are optional, not obligatory.
Okay. Now, we talked before the break about Medicare now requiring physicians who accept Medicare to go through an end-of-life scenario with their patients.
Right.
Now, you know as well as I do that sometimes the way a question is presented makes all the difference in the world.
Absolutely.
So a doctor says, "You don't want to suffer, do you?"
Exactly.
Oh, I don't want to suffer.
No one wants to
Right,
suffer.
right.
No one wants to suffer.
So, you know, if you were talking to doctors,
Yes.
and I'm sure that you have at time to time, personally or maybe in a
Yes,
group,
yes.
What do you tell the doctors?
Well, first of all, one thing that I like to remind doctors of is that it's not just a recent phenomenon, but go back into ancient history. The medical profession was always regarded as a sacred profession,
Right.
comparable to that of a priest.
Right.
Why? Because you're dealing with the sacred reality of life. And therefore, down through the ages, the doctors have had two goals. One is to cure, but then if you can't cure, to care for, but never to kill. Never to kill.
Never.
And this is the thing. It's a degradation of the medical profession itself to turn doctors into quote-unquote hired killers.
Okay, and this is now going to lead us into a very serious issue in our country right now. As far as I know, there are now 5 states that have...
I think it's 6.
Is it 6?
California just recently.
Oh, my. Physician-assisted suicide, which is
yes.
oxymoron as far as
Yes,
physician-assisted
yes,
suicide.
exactly.
And I'm told that they're moving in quickly into New York and to Maryland.
I wouldn't be surprised.
Okay. Now, how is this conceivable that states would actually allow murder because in the old days, suicide itself was a crime?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that, again, it goes back to one of the 2 primary causes for the culture of death, articulated by Pope John Paul II in the Evangelium Vitae, the Gospel of Life, a false notion of freedom, autonomy. If you take the word autonomy and break it apart, auto, nomos, to be a law unto oneself. Now, relatively speaking, of course, when we internalize the law of God, we can be, quote unquote, a law unto ourselves, because that law is based not upon our own likes or dislikes or whims, but of course on the internalized law of truth, of reality, of God himself. But autonomy, as understood today, is, well, as you said it before, pro-choice. Something is right because I choose it, because I want it, because it fits my desire to live a comfortable existence. And again, we have to realize that our lives are not given to us by God to be comfortable, but to know, love, serve him, and build up the family of man. In other words, life is a gift, a grace, but it's also a task, it's also a responsibility.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people don't realize that it is a responsibility, but it's not just to me, it is to society, that my life is a gift to society. And yet, you talked about, doctors being one of the pillars of society, and yet now we have doctors who are willing to, well, we have certainly the abortion doctors, but now we have doctors that are willing to kill at the end of life.
Exactly.
And I think what we see now is that in our country, I'm sure this is true in Western civilization, that life has become cheap.
Exactly.
Life has become very, very cheap.
Exactly.
And who would have conceived of the thought that a doctor would take away life?
Exactly.
Now, I'll give you an example. There's a lot of discussion about capital punishment in our own country. And those who say, well, it's permissible under certain circumstances, and those who say, no, we shouldn't do it. It's a political issue to a great extent.
Yes.
What personally repulses me? That if a doctor is the one administering the lethal injection.
Well, many times a lot of doctors will not participate in the execution of a prisoner by lethal injection simply because, again, it's a violation of the ethos of their profession.
Yeah.
I'm a life carer and curer, but I am not a killer.
Right. I always look back on the great pontificate of John Paul, St. John Paul.
Oh, St. John.
And you remember the condition he was in? He had Parkinson's disease. He was debilitated terribly. Once a strong, vibrant, handsome athlete.
So. Yes.
And then the disease took control of him.
Yes.
But he never gave up.
Nope.
He never gave up. He kept going. I mean, even to the point where that people had to feed him and clean him.
Right.
But he kept going. And I remember most clearly, I think was, about a week, 10 days before he died, he comes out to the papal window at St. Peter's, and the crowd.
Couldn't speak.
He couldn't speak anymore. He tried. Those last moments he tried, and he raised his hand to bless the people. And the crowd went crazy, and they were crying. To me, that was the greatest sermon he ever preached. And so, folks, we're here today. We're talking. This is an upbeat program. Well, maybe at times it didn't sound that way, but the fact of the matter is the end product is upbeat. Look at Christ, how he suffered on the cross, and then there was the resurrection. Look at John Paul, how he suffered, and he becomes a saint of the church. Suffering sometimes is the way that we become saints. Mother Teresa said, when we suffer, it's like God giving us a kiss because he sees his son all over again. Exactly. Hey, folks, this has been a wonderful session with Father Cooney. Thank you so much. Come back again next week. You can follow us on Facebook and Twitter and on YouTube. I'm for Action for Life. I hope you are too. God bless you all. Have a great week.
God bless.
Thanks so much.
Excellent. Very good.
We trust that this week's Action for Life program has challenged and encouraged you in honoring, respecting, preserving, and protecting human life. If you'd like to support this ministry or just get more information, we invite you to visit our website at www.actionforlife.net.
Time to move on, we're Christian soldiers. God's gone missing, Jesus too.